And now, from Nashville Public Television's Studio A, celebrating authors, literature, and ideas for more than 3 decades, this is A Word on Words with John Seigenthaler.
Hello, I'm John Seigenthaler. Welcome once again to A Word on Words. My guest today is Tim Ghianni. Tim always wanted to be a newspaper man, and he realized that dream. Spent 33 years writing for daily papers, the Leaf Chronicle, the Nashville Banner, and the Tennessean. Together with his co-author, Rob Dollar, he earned a reputation as an award-winning outlaw journalist, outlaw in quotes, outlaw journalist who stood up to wrongdoers and wrongdoing. Tim's here to talk about when newspapers mattered, the News Brothers and their shades of glory. It was a time when newspapers searched for the truth, made a difference in society. Tim, great to have you here.
Thanks, John. It's my pleasure. I appreciate being asked to be here.
Nice to talk about this book. What a cover. I must say, who designed that cover?
Actually, it was done, those are all pictures, of course, from my career, but it was done it was published by Westview, and the woman, Mary Catherine Nelson, out there took my pictures, and she made the montage for us.
Well, it's a wonderful cover, and should anybody see it on a bookstore newsstand, they ought to get it. It'll be attractive. Talk about the News Brothers and how they came to be, because it's interesting. It's a fascinating crowd of people.
Well, thanks, John. Well, we came to be kind of spun out of bad news stories. We were dealing with a lot of. I was a young guy. I was 30, and we were dealing with some murders. There was a young man named Rodney Long. He was a football player who was murdered. A young woman, Kathy Nishiyama, a 16-year-old. Yeah. She was murdered almost in the same basic time. They're different criminals, different crimes. But we were covering them as the associate editor and the columnist for the paper. I was kind of directing the coverage and writing the parent stories, etc., and directing the coverage with a police reporter. And all this began to take, we had other things happening, people dying at Fort Campbell. We were up in Clarksville, so people dying at Fort Campbell, people dying on the roads. There's a lot of bad news going on. And kind of to let off stress, it was basically one day, out of peak, I guess, we had to come into one day, they're turning the paper into, we're going to have a Saturday afternoon paper or Saturday morning paper, adding an extra day's publication. So I was tired. We'd all worked the night before. We were in the middle of murders. And I said, let's everybody wear sunglasses to work today. Everybody wear shades. And then my buddy, my co-author, said, we'll just call ourselves the News Brothers. And so Rob Dollar. And so that day to work, I went in, I ran the Sunday paper, and I wore my shades, and he wore his shades. And then Jerry Manley, who was a dear friend, he ended up working for you most of his career, but he was a dear friend. He wore his shades, and so that it became a way. We did some hijinks to kind of let off steam.
It happens in every newsroom.
It happens. It's just the same.
Did in those days. I'm not sure it still does.
I don't think it would be acceptable now, but it was the same sort of thing that I'm sure happened at 1100 Broadway back then. I'm sure it happened in any newsroom. You'd have people letting off steam.
A lot of practical joking, and a lot of practical joking on people in the newsroom and people out of the newsroom.
That's right.
In a real sense, the book is an obituary on newspapers as they used to be.
Yes, it is. It's a lamentation. It
is. But obituaries are not supposed to be funny, and there's humor interlaced with all of these stories throughout the book. And of course, the photographs of the News Brothers and of the celebrities you encountered during a long career really makes the book a fascinating read. But I want to come back to those two murders.
Okay.
Because it seems to me that those two tragic events, young football star from Austin Peay and this bright young Asian woman, Nishiyama family, lost a beautiful child. It seems to me, as I go through the book, that the two of you had it on your mind, and it affected your careers from that point on. What's wrong with what I just said?
There's really nothing wrong with what you just said. these murders were so. I was still living in a. I mean, I dealt with crime and everything, but it had always been someplace else. These other people I don't know. All of a sudden, there's this boy and girl next door sort of murders at almost at the same time, and I got to know their moms and dads, and I got to know the murderers, and I got to know how it affected the communities. Both happened in the community, so it affected the community, and it affected the way that I saw life. It affected it affected a lot of the things that I was doing. It affected a lot of. Maybe I threw myself even more full speed into my work. Although I always was a 100% guy, but also it changed how we saw life. It's more fleeting, of course, but also the tragedy of dealing with these deaths. I just couldn't shake it. In fact, I talked to Rodney Long's mother and Kathy Nishiyama's father to this day. They are Facebook friends, but I talk to them to this day. I've never been able to shake. That's really the genesis of the book. I sat down and one day in my early time after I got a buyout from the Tennessean, and so I started writing as a way to, I thought, well, I've lived with this stuff forever, and it does affect my life, and it affects my best buddy's life also. I said, I'm going to write about these murders, and I got to a certain point, and I couldn't see where I was going to take it next. And so I said, Rob, here's what I've got. I've got 40,000 words or so. You read through it. I said, let's do it we were a team. We had a lot of fun. We did a lot of things together, but it also affected us both. He was the cops reporter.
But those murders affected you both.
Right.
I go through the book and I note that chapters you wrote are designated Tim. The chapters he wrote are designated Rob. It looks to me like you had the burden of work, but the two of you are seamless in the way you put it together. Part of what our program's about is not just the story itself, how writers write, and as I say, if I didn't see your name, I well might not discern which of you. Your styles are very similar. I guess all of our styles as journalists are close, but talk a little bit about how the two of you work together on this book.
Sure, John. I appreciate that. We were hoping for a pretty good seamless match when we did our chapters. I would write, and then I would send it off to Rob, the whole thing. And I'd say, you read this thing, and I say, you add what you think you would like to add from your viewpoint to these same events. And then we kind of mapped out what the order of events would be. But he would write additions to the chapters, he would write his own chapters, and then he would also read through my stuff to see if there were things that I'd missed, some details, and he'd send it back to me with these suggestions on things that I'd missed, and then I'd read his and do the same thing. And we went through this for 8 months, sending this book back and forth in full. We didn't like send, here's a new chapter. Every time we edited it, we read the whole thing over again because we made sure that the new chapters fit in. So it was planned to be kind of a
So after the Clarksville Leaf Chronicle, you came to Nashville
right.
and worked for both papers,
right.
both
right.
Tennessee and the Banner. He goes to Kentucky, and does he go directly to the New Era?
Yes, he went to the Kentucky New Era. It's a long story.
In Hopkinsville, yeah.
In Hopkinsville, he went to the New Era, and he was there as one of their editors. He had different roles: managing editor, copy desk chief, different things.
Together, you have more than 60 years
right.
in journalism.
Right.
So you bring together the same story, but the story from two different perspectives, two different cities,
right.
two different experiences, but in many ways, the same experience. Let me ask you about some of the people you encountered, because the story is rich in anecdotes.
That's
and
good.
I'm just going to throw a name at you, and you can briefly give me your reaction.
Okay.
Because there are movie stars, there are sports stars, there are country music celebrities. O.J. Simpson.
O.J. Simpson seemed like the time when I saw him more than once, a couple of times. I was interviewing him because he was the spokesman for Acme Boot, Dingo, their Dingo part, and that Acme used to be up in Clarksville. And so O.J., I interviewed him a couple of times. One time I spent a good part of a day with him. seemed like just as nice a guy, just down home.
Ate ice cream.
Ate ice cream. Just it talked about he was the first African American ever to. The event was held at the Clarksville Country Club. He was the first African American, I was told at the time, to ever be allowed onto the club to actually participate. He was playing tennis with guys from Acme Boots, and so I spent time with him. I really, really liked him. You know, he ate ice cream. He was just a friendly fella. You know, of course, he had this charming personality that he obviously was not. He wasn't always so charming. With me, he was a charming guy. It was not hard to reading other things about him over the years. It wasn't hard to grasp this other when his violent side came out, or apparently came out. But with me, he was fine. We had a good time.
Talk about Tennessee Williams. Your Tennessee Williams.
Tennessee Williams. There was a gentleman. We would hang out after work. All journalists have their favorite.
The Camelot is yours. That's that's your blind pig, your bar.
That's right. That was the place where we went after work. And there were all kinds of characters. We would meet the cops there. We'd meet different people, all from all walks of life would be in there. There was a fella, and we nicknamed him Tennessee Williams. He was a Southern gentleman of some sort.
And you could tell from his accent, he was indeed.
He was a Southern.
He may have thought he was Tennessee Williams.
He may have thought he was a little bit different, but he was an interesting guy to hang around. Probably the best thing that defines him is a note I put in the book there about how the first time I met him, he told us about the time he went into a bank with an axe, and he put a mask over his. I remember Clarksville was a small town, and everybody knew who this guy was. It was his branch bank, and he went in there and he hollered Reaganomics. This was early in the 80s, and then he ran out, and he subsequently went to a restaurant that was run by a friend of mine. Police came and got him. He was taken care of. He wasn't threatening anybody, but it was just he'd made these kind of statements.
Political statements.
That's right. He's making political statements. Everybody knew who he was. Yeah, he had a stocking mask on, and he was carrying an axe. He didn't threaten anybody, and he was just making a statement. And that's the kind of guy. Last time I saw him, he was living in Nashville, and he was he was calling me. I was at the Banner then. He was calling me regularly. First, he was in jail. Then he was calling me, and eventually he started hanging out around the paper. And one day he was coming in to try to see me at the Banner, and he was all dressed. He was painted head to toe in Indian, like a Native American Indian costume, red. He painted himself red, and he had war paint. Had the headdress on, and he had a spear. And he was going to come in, and he wanted to come and see me. The guards knew that he'd been hanging around the building, and they didn't let me go out and see him. So,
you know. The phone rings one day, and there's a call for your colleague, and James Earl Ray. He's in prison, and you get those calls. How does it feel to get a call from a notorious criminal? I mean, you know, we're in those newsrooms all those years, both of us,
right.
Different times, different papers, but we get the same calls. And but I called from James Earl Ray. Talk about that.
Well, it was just, and I know you've had these same things. It's happened to you, I'm sure, much more than it happened to me. It was just a very strange thing that would happen. It would be, I came in earlier than most people. I was in at
6:30 in the morning early.
I came in at 4:30, and I don't know what time he had access to the phone, but he would call, and he wanted to talk to Charlie Appleton, who was one of my reporters on the state desk. So the state desk phone would ring, and it was him, and wanted to talk to Charlie, wanted to talk a little bit about himself, just make sure tell Charlie that he called. But the thing is, to talk to somebody like that, I mean, I've dealt with a lot of good and bad people, but this kind of notoriety and such a crime that just changed the world, and to just be talking to him, it actually kind of made me sick to my stomach more than anything. It was just, I mean, I was pleasant to him. I didn't know how else. I didn't say, hey, call back again.
Sure.
Glad to hear from you. But it just was a very strange, and this happened more than one time, but it was a very strange occurrence to talk to James Earl Ray.
And for Charlie, it was a news source,
Right.
and he was getting, those interviews were valuable to him.
Charlie was getting a lot of stories out of the Ray's Ray and his brother and Ray's wife. He was doing stories about that, so it was important for Charlie to keep that contact. Just I happened to be the one on the receiving end of the phone call.
In the front of the book, there's some quotes from people who really liked the book and who were your pals, and one of those, somebody interviewed more than once, is Chris Christopherson.
Right.
Talk about that.
Well, Chris is a good friend. He wrote a nice recommendation on the book. But when I first moved to Nashville in 1972, my parents had moved down here from Chicago. And one of the things that I really wanted to do, I'd already learned about Christopherson, and I really wanted to meet Christopherson. That was I thought that would be a good thing to do, because I liked the way he used words. I love words. And so I never met him then, but eventually, during the course of my time, I was in Clarksville then for a long while, but when I came back to Nashville, I would eventually I got a chance to interview Chris on the telephone about a movie. I think it was about a movie he was doing. And the interview went so well. This was when I was at the Tennessean as entertainment editor. The interview went so well that Chris and his wife called me back, or sent me a note, I can't remember, that they really enjoyed their time. He enjoyed his time with me, and if they'd like to see me. I was interviewing him in Hawaii, where he lives most of the time. And so when they came to town, they'd like to meet me. So he came to town, but he came to town after Johnny Cash died, and he came to be the eulogist for Cash's funeral. I knew Cash a little bit, not much, and I liked him. But Chris then was in town, and he was here. They were going to do a TV special. He was doing other things, so he was going to be in town for a couple of weeks. So they called. His wife called first, and she said, "Tim, Chris would really like to see you if you got time." And I said, "Yeah, I've got time." And she said, "Well, he's available Sunday afternoon." And I said, "Well, why don't I pick him up at the hotel and we'll walk down Music Row, where he lived all those years ago." And he thought that was a good idea. He brought his son, who's Johnny Cash Christopherson, was 16 at the time, who thought this would be fun to do it as a high school film project. And so we walked down Music Row, which had changed a lot. Chris hadn't been there during the daytime in 30 years, and it had changed so much. And so I was showing him where the Tally-Ho Tavern used to be. Well, I used to go to the Tally-Ho Tavern. I was looking for some of these guys to hang out with. And, and it was at that point a curb building. I don't know if it still is. And the studio where he used to work, where he would clean ashtrays when Dylan was recording. And he was telling me all these stories, and actually at the buildings or where the buildings had been. So it became a really good
Another day in the life of a journalist.
Right. It was just,
for those of you just tuning in, I'm talking with Tim Ghianni about his book. He wrote it with Rob Dollar. It's called When Newspapers Mattered. It's also called The News Brothers and Their Shades of Glory. It's chock full of anecdotes like that. You must have had, at some point, the two of you had to become selective about what went in and what went out. My guess is there's many interesting stories on the editor's floor as there are in the book. How did you decide?
Well, we wrote, and then we would think about what we would put in there. And we did have to eliminate people. We did have to eliminate events, because we really wanted to chronicle not just our experiences, but the change in how newspapers and how news that was one of the themes, of course, is how newspapers have changed. For better or worse, but how we saw them change. And so we knew that there were stories about that particular, that went in that vein, that had to be included. And then there's certain stories about the people that we saw, people that we met. We knew which ones we wanted to include as we were building toward this overall. We thought it was kind of, in a lot of ways, it's kind of like a MASH, like in a newsroom way, in lots of places. Lots of places it's a little bit melancholy, because I'm melancholy by nature, I guess. So but we did have to trim out different stories. In fact, Rob and I talk every 2 or 3 days, and he says, "Man, I wish we'd put this story in." I said, "Well, we didn't have room for that one." So when I read it through again this last week. And I like it, but
it's one of the great problems of writing a book is that always more to go in there. I remember doing the biography on James K. Polk, and Arthur Smith said, "Oh, it's just great. It's a terrific manuscript. It's about 40,000 words too long, and we're going to have to cut it. But you know, there are limits on what can go in, and so some stories never quite make it. But that's what the next book can be about. Let me ask you about, and you think back on this long career, and it strikes me as I think back on my own career, particularly my days as a reporter. There is a sort of I used to call it a level of insanity that infects every journalist who walks into a newsroom. And I don't really mean that, and it's facetious. I don't mean to knock anybody, my colleagues or me or anybody else. But there is, I think, inside newsrooms a different culture, and people interact in different newsrooms in very much the same ways,
right,
but differently than other people act or would understand. What do you say to that?
That's true, John. Because you were in newsrooms longer than I was. It's something that happens. It's wonderful. It's not always happy, but it's a wonderful, magical experience to be in a newsroom. If I could be in a newsroom like a newsroom was 10 years ago, I would love that. There's no better place to be than it's a madness. There's the hustle bustle, there's the sound, there are always people talking, there's yelling, there is a fair amount of colorful language, a lot of coffee, a lot of joking. You have to joke. You're dealing with horrible things sometimes, and sometimes you're joking about it. I don't want to, it's not because they don't affect you, it's because you have to deal with these things. You're dealing with, you're dealing one day with a vice president, for the vice presidential candidate, the next day with murderers, and you've got to crank out these stories, and it's a fine madness in a newsroom. I loved my time in the newsrooms. I loved it. I mean, and I tried to paint that.
A fine madness.
It is.
That's a perfect description of what it is, because, and I'm thinking back on all those years, 1,000 different reporters. I can't think of one who wasn't infected by it.
I can't either. Even the most straight-laced guy or woman would come into a newsroom, and in order to survive, I mean, they may decide they don't want to be there. There are times I've seen people leave, but if in order to survive in that environment, they join in and they enjoy it. They're part of it. It's a team. It's like, I assume it's probably like an NFL locker room, that you got to joke around, you got to have fun with each other before you go out and carry out your task. I assume there's that kind of a looseness.
Well, as I look at the photographs in the book, they're wonderful, they're interspersed throughout. Altogether, they make a wonderful photo album, and all the people, all the personalities are there. And I note, sort of to go back where we were on those two murders, photographs of both the Nishiyama killer and the killer of the young football player. And then I run across in the back of the book a letter to the parole board. Talk about that letter.
Well, this is why this story stayed with me forever. When I do talk to Barbara Mack, who is Rodney Long's mother, and David Fry, who was one of the killers, was coming up for parole 2 years ago, the time of the Nashville flood. Yeah, so it was 2 years ago, and there was a parole hearing, and they asked me, the family, and I don't usually get involved in news, of course. At this point, I wasn't.
We don't.
Yeah,
that's a rule.
As
a rule,
right? We don't. And
but we do then occasionally.
On occasion, I was freelancing by this point anyway, so I wasn't answering to anybody, but because of how this man had changed and damaged so many lives, I mean, I wasn't going for he had a life sentence, which was fine, but he was up for parole, so I wrote this very long letter to the parole board, and I was actually going to present it at the hearing and testify at the hearing. They asked me to, but because my house got flooded in the Nashville flood the day that was going to happen, I couldn't make it down there, but they did put this letter into the, what do you call it, into the testimony there. But it talks about how this man had changed and damaged lives, not just killing a young man was bad enough, but he affected so many lives by doing that I didn't think he should be granted parole.
And there was no parole.
There was no parole.
And there also is, in the back of the book, actual articles. I don't know how you selected those, but I reviewed them. It's a wonderful selection. You know, time flies by,
Right.
and we haven't got a lot of time. We have about 2 minutes left. I know you're still writing.
Right.
What's next?
Well, of course, I write as a freelance writer to feed my family. But I have 2 books going. In fact, I'm going to have to pull this out because I can't. It's got a long. Excuse me.
Be my guest.
It's got a long title. This I wrote as a collection of during the flood in Nashville, as I was dealing with what was happening, because we did lose about half our house. Not a lot of people were a lot worse. We could live upstairs, but I did a daily blog on Facebook. And it was about dealing with FEMA, dealing with the government. But then it began to be a lot of fantasy involved because I was dealing with a lot of stress. And so I compiled these, in a book that I put on Kindle, in ebook format last year. And it was called After the Flood, with a long subtitle, which is my semi-true tale of soggy and nightmare days when Bob Dylan, Barack Obama, and the band shot hoops into my driveway while government, big insurance, and corporate America allowed Nashville's great flood to attack my family.
Have you gotten all that on the cover?
It's on the cover.
It's easy on an ebook. If it's Kindle, it's much easier.
It's easier. And so, yeah, that was and I just wanted to do it, and it didn't sell that. I mean, I wanted to do it. When I wrote it for the blog on Facebook, I actually would tell people it was out there, because some things, there were funny things. I had Obama was there at my house shooting hoops a lot. He was hiding from his wife. I have Bob Dylan there. I have all these things happening. But also there's a lot of information about how to deal with FEMA and where you need to go to find things to dry out your basement. And that was in there as well, but done in a very satire-filled format.
Well, the satire all through this book, too. As I said, time flies, and we've run out of the time that we had. It's been great to have you here.
It's been my pleasure.
And it's been great to have all of you here. Thank you for watching. I'm John Seigenthaler for A Word on Words. Keep reading.